My name is Michael Doolittle. Um, I joined the Army on June 27th, 1962. Um, I went to Vietnam in late December of 1966. Um, I was assigned to the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, A Company, 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry. I was originally assigned as the FDC in an 81 millimeter mortar platoon. Um, but we were a ground unit and we never took our mortars into the field. So we were just another infantry platoon. I was originally trained as an infantryman. My work with mortars started in Germany in 65, after I'd been in the Army like 3 years. And I was really good with mathematics. So the FDC, Fire Direction Center, plotting and directing fire and all that kind of stuff was an easy fit for me. Vietnam, we didn't take our mortars were just heavy, and we were a ground unit, not mechanized, so we didn't ever take them. So I was in Vietnam from late December of 1966 through the end of July 1968. And yeah, it was an experience that'll never go away.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the things that happened in that time period. I mean, momentous
Mm-hmm.
things in the history of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I was there during the Tet Offensive as well. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so the memories are sometimes not in a chronological storybook. They're prominent things that happened and things that were very impactful and other things that were just repetitious. You know, humping through the jungle. Loaded down with your rucksack and I carried 45 loaded magazines for my M16. I mean, rounds in the magazines, 45 of them. You were weighted down with stuff. I had 2 blocks of C4, 2 pounds each, Claymore mine, 6 hand grenades, um, 2 gas grenades, 2 smoke grenades, your C rations, changes of socks, all that other paraphernalia that you carry around. Um, all the gear, your trenching tool to dig your foxholes, and when you think about how much you got, 6 canteens of water. Just think about it, 6 quarts of water, on D rings and whatnot, and when you think about the load that you carried, I guess it was maybe 65, 70 pounds or thereabouts.
Yeah.
Claymore mine weighs about 7 or 8 pounds or something like that. Um, and the C4, the C4 was one of the more important things because that's how you heated your C rations with plastic explosives. You tear off a little piece of the clay and roll it in the ball and light that on fire and it burned like propane. So that's how you heated your coffee. We probably used more C4 to heat C rations than we did blowing things up.
Well, that's interesting.
Just those little tidbitty things that not many people that weren't there would realize.
Yeah. Yeah. So you arrive in Vietnam with 4 years of experience in the Army, including some
Yeah,
overseas experience. How old are you when you get there?
I was 21 and a half years of age. I was born in 1945, June 27, 45. So yeah, I'd been in the Army 4.5 years. I did a year in Korea. I did almost a year as a drill sergeant at Fort Ord, California, teaching bayonet training and at the Combat Development Experimental Center. That was out of Fort Ord and Hunter Liggett Military Reservation down there at King City. And then I reenlisted to go to Germany. I'd heard all the stories from guys that had spent time in Germany, chasing Fraulein's and drinking beer. And that sounded adventurous to me. So I reenlisted to go to Germany. So I went to Germany in late 1964. I was in Mannheim, 8th Infantry Division, Coleman Barracks. That was also the site of the major stockade for the Army in Europe.
Yep.
And so I was there until mid to late year 66 when I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I left out of Germany, I think in September, October. Went on a 30-day leave, bought a brand new Mustang and drove it across country. Figured if I was going to Vietnam, I might as well enjoy this 30-day leave, right?
So this is a 66 Mustang?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
is that a 289?
Well, actually, it was a 67. The 67s had already come out.
Okay.
They come out in like September of the year before.
Yeah.
And so I bought this burgundy red or burgundy color, black interior Mustang 289, 271 hypo, hot rod,
All right.
and drove across country with a friend of mine and partied as hard as I could for that 30 days before I went to Vietnam.
So you're driving from, I'm guessing, maybe somewhere in New Jersey. Where did you come? Where did you come?
Yeah. I picked up the car, I think in
Hackensack?
forgot the name, Burlington, New Jersey, where
Okay.
I picked up the car. Some Ford dealership there.
I see.
And I bought it in Germany through the PDX system.
I see.
And so they designated a dealer that I could pick it up at,
Hmm.
And so this young man from my unit who was also going to Vietnam, Tom Simon, and we drove across country. I took him home. He lived in Racine, Wisconsin. And so I drove up to through Chicago midday, 4:30 in the afternoon. Well, that was an experience on a weekday driving through Chicago.
So as you're
Uh,
driving across
and
America,
then I left. And
so as you're driving across the country with your friend, uh, are you aware at that point that your next stop is Vietnam?
yeah, I was painfully aware of that. The reason I volunteered to go to Vietnam, and this is more of the personal tragedy of my own life. I had got married I took a leave and went home to California and got married to a old high school girlfriend. And she came to Germany on January the 1st, 1966. And within a month or so, she started messing around on me while I was out in the field and on maneuvers and stuff. And I was the last to know. You know how Army guys talk.
Yeah.
We were up in a training area at Baumholder, Germany. We had a beer hall, the third floor of this big barracks. And, people mouths get a little loose when they're drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the guys made a rather distasteful comment about my wife. I came across the table with a beer bottle and I threw him out the third floor window. I mean, really, I just picked him up, threw him out the window. I'm a pretty good sized guy, 6'2". I was about 185, 90 pounds. And MPs were called, company commander was called. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that. MP's came and company commander came in from the BOQ and wanted to know what the fight was about. And I was, I could have been lucky. There was a lot of snow on the ground. He hit the snowbank and he didn't really hurt himself all that much. But the story came out, about my wife and what was going on. So I went back to Lampertheim, where I lived just outside Coleman Barracks. And the tragedy of a dysfunctional marriage to a young person. Like I was only, I wasn't quite 21 then. I was 20 years old. And I was wounded, and so I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I figured, I'm gonna go to Vietnam, be a warrior, or maybe I'll die or something.
Was it in any part to escape punishment? Like, was it a deal that you cut, or was it
No,
just,
no,
I need to get out of here?
it was feeling myself humiliated and wounded, and I was going to go to Vietnam and become a war hero and try to erase that memory from my life. And if I died, well, that's, uh, my ex-wife would feel bad the way she treated me, or whatever the pity me thing was at the time. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but it was one of those very traumatic experiences for me as a young man, um, and so I ended up in Vietnam. So the whole journey across the country wasn't so much about I'm going to Vietnam. It's I'm going to party. I've got a brand new car. You
Mhm.
know, yeah, you're like Mustang Sally.
Sure.
The song.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so that was the whole thing.
Mm.
And I never really gave Vietnam much thought until the end of that leave. And I had I wouldn't say repaired, but I had rekindled the relationship with my wife, and I left her the car, and I went off to Vietnam. And a couple months later, she sent me a notice that she wanted a divorce. So I sent the finance company a letter saying, I ain't paying for this car. You want to go get it? Here's where it's at.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So,
And
what do you remember about arriving in Vietnam? I mean, had you? I
oh
mean,
boy.
let me back up. Had you talked with guys who had been over there? Did you have friends who
No,
came home from
no.
Vietnam?
I had never, I mean, this was early in Vietnam. So, the first major units went over in 65.
Hmm.
That was the first cav, Colonel Hal Moore's group, major units going over there. So
Hmm.
this was still in the build-up period. So, and being in Germany for that previous couple of years, we didn't have any returning, Vietnam veterans coming to our units yet.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so I'd never spoken to anybody. I did have a few Korean War veteran friends that were still in the Army. Um, and I had a really interesting first sergeant in Germany, and he was really supportive. I had a great platoon sergeant there as well. And not, the first sergeant had been in Korea, but the platoon sergeant had. He was the youngest platoon sergeant E7 in all of Europe, and maybe on all of the Army. He was 24 years old, and he was an E7 in 1965.
Wow.
Um, just unheard of. And he was a great guy, and he nurtured me. He's the one that got me into the FDC of the mortar platoon. He was a mortar platoon sergeant, and I was kind of a troubled young guy, and so he kind of took me under his wing and helped me out, and I'm very thankful for him.
Hmm.
But going to Vietnam, you had no idea what to expect, none at all. And one of the things about the Army when they're getting ready to put you on a plane or a ship or whatever and send you to a foreign country, they do a lot to desensitize you to where you're going. It's kind of like, you got to imagine you're about ready to go to a war. And the one thing that they don't want is you to hesitate, especially you're an infantry guy, right? Don't hesitate to pull the trigger.
Mm.
If you're going to go under your head and try to moralize killing somebody, you're going to end up dead. It's like in bayonet training. When I was teaching bayonet, they had this old saying: "There's only two kinds of bayonet fighters: the quick and the dead." And and that's the mentality that they're trying to promote in you as you're getting ready to go. If you've got this moral, compunction about being able to kill somebody, you're you're a threat to the guy to your left and your right and yourself.
Right. Right.
And so that's why the military likes young guys, draft them when they're 19, 20 years old,
They're a
um,
little more malleable then.
oh
And I'm sure it's,
yeah.
as much as it is about killing the enemy, I'm sure it's just as much, maybe more about keeping you alive and the guy to your left and the guy to your right.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's all of that combined.
Hmm.
That's why when you talk about PTSD, and I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself here,
Yeah.
is that most people don't understand that there's two components to PTSD. One is the post-traumatic stress, and the other is the moral injury
Sure.
uh, that that you're faced with making those moral decisions about surviving.
Sure.
And it's not a moral decision; it's a survival thing.
Right.
So Yeah, I understand that.
So when you got there, what is most vivid in your memory about first impressions of Southeast Asia?
Boy, you know, you're not going through a jetway, right? Like a modern airport. You're out on the tarmac and you're coming down this big long set of steps with your bag, and it's the heat and the humidity smacks you in the face.
Yeah, and especially bouncing off that tarmac.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the smell. And I got there, it was like, oh, it must have been 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that.
Okay.
3 o'clock in the morning, the humidity, the heat, and the smell just smacks you in the face.
How would you describe
It
that
was
smell?
overwhelming. Pardon?
How would you describe the smell?
Really difficult. It
I've
was an
heard guys
amalgam of
I've heard
things.
guys describe it as, rotting vegetation.
Yes, well, that's part of it. Yeah, it's kind of like being a quite a ways away from a garbage dump
Mm,
in that sense. But rotting vegetation and heat and maybe it had a mildew or it's hard to separate the smells. It's just this amalgam that overwhelms your senses.
sure.
And
Probably
and
some gun smoke in there,
uh,
some jet
not
exhaust.
so much, not so much at Benoit Air Base where I landed.
Mm,
Um, there may have been some, but that was a minor thing compared to the rest of the smell
sure.
that permeated the air.
Mhm.
And of course, it's also your attitude. There's some anxiety. Now that you're on the ground in a war zone, um, you don't quite know what to expect in the next moment or two. Um, Fortunately, this was in a time when Benoit and Saigon were not so much under any kind of imminent attacks or anything.
Okay.
Um, that all started to happen, about a year later when you got in close to Tet
Yeah.
and the time frame moved on with all the American troops.
Michael, do you
I know at
remember,
the
sorry, do you remember
go ahead.
the first time you locked eyes with a guy who was going the other way, who had been there for a year, was on his way home?
No, because the unit I went to um, had just gotten there in October.
Hmm.
And so when I got to my unit, which was, oh, last couple of days of December, first couple of days of January, um, yeah, everyone there had a distance to go, 9 months
Yeah.
or thereabout, 10
Yeah.
months left to go.
Because you
And
mentioned
and so there were
it was
no,
during you mentioned it
yeah,
was during the buildup. So yeah, not surprising that you didn't
right.
run into a lot of
Yeah.
guys headed the
It
other way. But I just wondered, a reason I wanted to emphasize that is because I mean, nowhere you look prepares you for what's ahead.
oh, yeah, you're so right there. Nothing can prepare you for a war. I'm nothing. I mean, I was raised on World War II movies. I probably saw every World War II movie that there is.
Mhm.
And I guess maybe that kind of is in the back of your mind that you're expecting, that kind of threat to you, from all the war movies that you see, and whether or not it's in the entry point where all the troops are massing before they're being parsed out to wherever they're going. It's always the unknown. You're
Mm,
going into the unknown. And even when you get there and you start to have a few peripheral conversations with the guys that are already there, they're kind of looking at you strange. You know the saying, the FNGs.
mhm.
Well, everybody looks at you because you're an unknown quantity. And especially in this unit I was in, because they were all drafted together.
I see.
They all trained together. So they had a bonding. They'd all been in the Army about a year
Hmm.
total. That's from the day they were drafted to the time I met them.
Yeah,
Um,
and always together.
and so, yeah, I'm a replacement, and on top of that, I'm not just any replacement. 4.5 year Army veteran, E5, and I'm maybe a threat to them in some form or fashion. I
Mhm.
got more time and grade in my rank, and so I outranked everybody in my platoon.
Mhm.
Uh, and and they don't know who you are. They don't know if they can trust you. And that's kind of the thing with the new guys. You're an unknown quantity. Will you panic when the bullets start flying, or how are
Yeah,
you going to react to
I
different circumstances?
yeah, I never thought about it before, but it seems like, I mean, I've thought about it in the context of officers, but I've never thought about it in the
Mm,
context of enlisted men where a new guy who's a PFC is suspect and maybe a little scary, but a new guy who's an E5,
yeah.
that must be even scarier, right? Because of the
In a lot of ways, because you're not you obviously don't have the trust of the people around you.
right.
Um, so you're a new guy, and so they don't want to thrust you into the leadership role of that group right anyway. And so going out on ambush patrols and all these different kinds of maneuvers that we constantly did all the time. Ambush patrols were a big thing. I went out probably on uh, a dozen or more ambush patrols in the first month, um, not only from our base camp where we work very seldom, but
Mhm.
also when we would go out on search and destroy operations. When we'd set up our night position, we're always sending out listening patrols, LP positions where two or two guys, maybe three guys, might be 100 yards out in front of your perimeter as an early warning system.
Mhm.
Or we would send out an ambush patrol a couple of hundred, 300-400 meters out in front of a major unit area, and you'd have to plot defensive concentrations for artillery if you had to escape in the middle of the night. You spring an ambush, you don't want to stay there. Once you spring an ambush, you want to get the hell out of there. And you got to be able to get back into your own lines without your own guys shooting as well. So, you know, in the middle of the jungle, in the middle of the night, it's dark. There's no moonlight, there's no starlight, um, and everything seems to be amplified. Noises are amplified. You hear your own heartbeat a lot of the times. It can get in the way of you hearing other things. Um, you're trying to be quiet, and sometimes you think somebody's going to hear your heart pounding because you're anxiety ridden, or you know, uh, it's a really strange set of circumstances that you're facing that you've never faced before in your life.
Mhm.
And all of those things are frightening. The unknown is frightening. I don't know if you remember being a little kid. I remember we lived in the forest. We had a farm, and I remember looking out the window as a kid, and you'd see, either moonlight, clouds, and trees and shadows, and your mind can make up all kinds of, nightmares. There's a monster, and it's one of those Santana songs. There's a monster under your bed, and that's the jungle.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you remember the opening scene of Platoon,
I do.
the movie Platoon, Oliver Stone's movie. Okay, yeah, in the opening scene of Platoon, it's raining really hard, and you see a soldier there. I think it was Charlie Sheen with a helmet on and a poncho, and in the shadows behind him, you think, um, what you think you see is enemy soldiers moving in the jungle. And that's kind of the way it was there. You couldn't see 15 feet most often in the jungle. So much foliage and so little light because you're in a double, triple canopy jungle. And there's just nothing that shows through. And so that can be very deceiving. And of course, your imagination likes to play, these huge tricks on you. And so, you're always imagining something a lot more gruesome than what's there sometimes. Anyway, that's just one of the reflections that I remember when I saw the movie Platoon, not much else in the movie really reminded me of anything that happened to me. But that first scene was, set the tone for, your imagination.
Yeah. I've talked to guys who had trouble making it through that picture.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so can you just talk a little bit about your experience during the time you were there? Any action that you recall very vividly, or any friendships that became important to you? What are kind of the big things that you brought home with you from Vietnam?
Well, let me describe the biggest thing that happened while I was there. This was really big, on the par with Hal Moore's story. We were soldiers once. We were in Operation Junction City 2, and we were preparing to make an assault on an LZ. Originally, we were planning on assaulting LZ Silver, but the mechanized unit that was supposed to get up and close to LZ Silver before we landed was having trouble being ambushed and slowed down and whatnot. So at the last minute, they changed the LZ goal.
And this was
And they
and this
really
was
didn't spend that much time prepping it. They did. Go ahead.
sorry, this Junction City 2 was if I'm not mistaken, that was what, October?
No, Junction City 2 started in about mid-March of 67.
Okay, thank you.
Right. This LZ that we were assaulting, we assaulted on March the 19th, 1967. And it was called Landing Zone Gold. And we were going to set up a fire support base there. And so we flew out of Dao Tiang by fixed wing aircraft to Suoi Da, which was a staging area where the helicopters were going to pick us up and take us into LZ Gold. Well, in the briefing before we went, one of the other battalion commanders of the 212 Infantry, a guy named Joe Elliott, was he was a lieutenant colonel. He was a pet staff member of Westmoreland who needed command experience, so he got this battalion, and he was going to be the lead. His 212 was going to be the lead element, and the brigade commander, a colonel by the name of Marshall B. Garth, was in a conversation with some of the others, and Joe Elliott had said that if his unit was going in, he was going to be in the lead helicopter, right? So he was going to lead from the front. Well, somebody mentioned to Colonel Garth that that Joe Elliott was a favored uh, officer of General Westmoreland, and so it would look really bad if his helicopter was blown apart and Joe Elliott died. Colonel Garth could kiss his future career goodbye or something like that. And so they stood down and they ordered some artillery to come in on the LZ. And then he switched and put the 322 as the lead element going in. Now, all these little stories are in the book, Duel with the Dragon, that we talked about the other day. So anyway, the 322 A and B company were the lead elements going in. And B company was in the first flight of helicopters going in. And A company was in the next flights of helicopters going in. And as we went into the LZ with very little, intelligence on what to expect, we didn't know it was going to be a hot LZ. It was very hot. We lost 6 helicopters, 2 completely blown apart, and all in, 7 soldiers and 2 door gunners and 2 pilots dead in each one. And 4 other helicopters were destroyed and had to be hauled out. I was on a helicopter, one back into the side of one that blew up, and the concussion blew me out the door as we were coming down. I was maybe 12, 15 feet up. And you're prepared to jump anyway, but when you get unceremoniously blown out of the door of the helicopter. You're flailing as you fall,
And are you
and I hit
carrying
rather
70,
hard.
are you carrying 70 pounds worth of gear that you talked about?
Oh yeah,
Oh
oh
man.
yeah.
So, I
And
mean,
also, we took our mortars in on this. This was the only time in my experience in Vietnam we actually took our mortars. And so yeah, I'm got 70 pounds on my back, and I get blown out the helicopter. And I land kind of on my knees head first, and wrenched my neck and banged up my knee, got a crease in my head, probably had a concussion. But the mortar rounds were coming in on us, and the snipers were shooting at you, and you know, it's either you're going to be an active soldier to help defend yourself, or you might be the weak link in the chain that ends to your demise. So you don't have any time to think about your pain unless you got a hole in your body and you're bleeding real bad. You're gonna respond. So anyway, the landing was really chaotic, but there was no follow-up attack other than they wanted to make the landing painful for us, and we had no idea why or how they had planned this. What we didn't know was that less than 1 kilometer away from this landing zone was the headquarters of the NVA 9th Infantry Division, the division that was in charge of all of the enemy activity around the Saigon area and the Iron Triangle and the like. We didn't know that until years later. But in any event, the landing, after maybe a half an hour or so, the snipers, we dispatched them with gunships and the like, and finally things calmed down and we started organizing our perimeter. And it was either late that day or maybe early the next day. This was a Sunday, by the way, that we landed. So either late Sunday or early Monday, they started bringing in the 105 howitzers, um, sling loading those in and setting up the perimeter. And Monday was rather quiet. We spent the day building our positions and whatnot. And because this was the only time we took our mortars with us, I was not on the perimeter. I was back where the artillery pieces were, maybe 50 yards or so from the actual perimeter, setting up our mortar platoon and our FDC and the like. Now, in the landing, we had lost one of our base plates and one of our tripods, and one of the backpacks with a lot of the rounds on it for our 81. So our 81s were almost inoperable as a platoon. But anyway, and we never fired a mortar round, that time we were there. But anyway, so by the end of Monday, all the artillery pieces were in place. The positions weren't really fully developed yet. They were going to more sandbags and the like. Um, and so we just thought, we didn't get any briefings that night that we were expecting anything. And I remember laying on the ground that night when it was, dark, and I could hear the rumble of a B-52 strike somewhere, in the distance. I mean, the ground actually shook and you could hear the rumble, so how far away it was, I have no idea. But I remember that night, trying to lay down and close your eyes, and it was a rather sleepless night. Early the next morning, before the sun came up, we always used to wake up in the morning real early and we do what we call a mad minute, which was all the positions on the perimeter would fire their weapons, burn up a magazine of ammunition into the woods and whatnot, in case there were any surprises out there. It was just kind of a demonstration of power. And before the Mad Minute and all that kind of stuff, and I was thinking about, okay, I need to get a cup of coffee, so I was thinking about rolling up my C4 in a little hole. And before I could even get to that, all hell broke loose. Mortar rounds, rocket rounds. The enemy was already in our perimeter. Um, this was known as the Battle of Suoi Tre. And it was chaos from the moment it started. which was about 5:45 in the morning or thereabouts. And you didn't get a chance to collect yourself at any time. It was survival from the first moment that it erupted. When you got enemy inside your perimeter from the very beginning, we had a ambush patrol, I think 9 guys or something like that, that got trapped outside, and I don't think any of them survived. It was just one of these things where we were overwhelmed. Our perimeter was collapsing in several areas. And this is the story too about a World War II hero by the name of Lieutenant. He was a lieutenant colonel now, um, John Vesey, who was a fill-in for the 277 artillery commander, who was at, I don't know, he had kidney stones or something. Um, John Vesey was the 25th Infantry Division's artillery officer, and he was assigned to fill in for their battalion commander until he came back. And so um, this, we had 18 105 howitzers in this perimeter, the 277 artillery. And we were firing, I mean, they were firing rounds point blank, and just the chaos of, you got these ammo piles. Each gun has an ammo pile. And as they fire around, they're pulling out the powder bags or the canister. And if a given charge for that shot was 5 powder bags, you're cutting 2 off and throwing them in a pile. If it's a 2 powder bag charge, you're cutting 5 off and throwing them in a pile. And so the pile of powder bags and the cardboard canisters that the rounds came in is getting big. And the rockets in the mortar rounds are setting off fires inside our perimeter in those powder bags and canisters and ammo piles. And as the morning wore on, our ammo piles are blowing up, and the fires are raging, and the machine gun, tracers are about belt high if you stood up, and they're just thick throughout the entire perimeter. And this LZ was this fire support base is probably 300 plus yards long and 150, 200 yards wide. And so you draw a circle around that, that's a pretty big perimeter. And the infantry population that's guarding the perimeter, A and B companies of the 322 infantry, we're probably, I don't know, 280 men or something like that, maybe a little less than that, maybe 250. You're spread out pretty far and wide. There's a lot of room in between each position, and there's 2 guys in each position at least. So there was a lot of room for the enemy to sneak into our perimeter. The chaos was just overwhelming. And as that morning wore on, and we finally got fighter jets in to help us, and other supporting artillery units, and we had these beehive rounds. I think altogether we had 30 beehive rounds. And they started firing those point blank. As the perimeter collapsed, the infantry backed up into the secondary positions, which were almost right under the muzzles of the 105 howitzers. And that is just absolute chaos. It's the only way I can describe it. And it's continuous. There's no let up and whatnot. And I remember in the din of this fighting, and probably at the point I thought it was hopeless, I remember hearing somebody hollering at me, and I turned around to look. I'm in my spider hole, and not too far from the muzzles of the 105 howitzers where we had backed in, and it was his. You could tell he was a commander of some kind. It was Colonel Vesey, and he was hollering for me to come over and help whatever he was doing. So I reluctantly got out of my hole and crawled on my elbows and knees, because boy, you certainly didn't want to stand up and crouch down. Machine gun rounds would have certainly cut you apart. And I crawled over to his position, maybe 40, 50 feet, and he directed me into opening these canisters of these rounds. And it was just this lieutenant colonel and a captain. There was no other no other crew there on the gun. And so I'm sitting down behind the gun and I'm starting to unwrap these rounds. I've never, the mortar rounds came pretty much in the same kind of package, only ours were all in one package. There weren't two packages for each round. In a 105 howitzer, you got the shell casing in one with the powder bags, and you got the projectile in another with the fuse and the timers. And so I'm fumbling opening up these canisters, and I remember lifting up my head and looking down the side of the gun. It's got these two legs that come out to support it, and it's got some ballistic plates, to kind of keep the crew from being shot. And I looked out the side and down the muzzle of the gun there, and just a horde of enemy coming at us, and the the bullets are pinging off all areas of this gun, and Colonel Vesey and this captain stood right up there behind the gun. I mean, guys, I just don't know how they muster that kind of bravery, except I guess you do when you're surviving. And I saw this mass of humanity coming at us, and I did not want to see. I just didn't feel like we were going to survive, and I just didn't want to see whatever was coming next. And so I buried my head into opening these rounds, and they started firing these beehive rounds. I don't know if you've heard of the beehive round. It's a
Well,
projectile with 8,000 little 1-inch finishing nail darts they call flechettes. And when they blow up, they're going forward at like, I don't know, 3,500 feet per second or something like that. And it's like a massive beehive going forward and spreading out, and it just devastates anything in its path. They fired off of this gun, they fired 4 or 5 of those rounds. And I remember um, vaguely, the explosions of the gun and the recoil of the gun, because the leg, I was leaning up against the leg and you could feel it each time it fired. And I remember all of a sudden, I hear this other noise, mechanical noise. Um, you're not sure if it's an aircraft or whatever it is, because there are jet fighters and there's propeller craft and helicopters and gunships and and I hear this noise, but it was the attitude and the change in the demeanor of Colonel Vesey and this captain. They seemed to have become elated, or um, they were not anxiety ridden and defensive. They were almost like high fiving each other. I don't think high fiving had been invented yet. You want to know the truth? But they were certainly feeling elated, and they just wandered away. And and I'm sitting there on the ground wondering what the hell's going on. And finally I managed to stand up, and I looked out in front of the gun, and of the nightmare of what I saw in front of the gun. Shredded bodies, just grotesque. It was disturbing in a lot of ways. Um, but the noise I heard was the tanks and APCs and whatnot coming to our rescue, and the 50 caliber machine guns. When you got, I don't know, 25 or 30 armored vehicles coming in, each one's got a 50 caliber on. And and realized that we had survived,
Michael,
and the battlefield was just littered with bodies. Unbelievable.
yeah. So what happened to you next?
Uh, I guess I was in a state of shock, certainly overwhelmed by the events of the morning. It's now approaching probably 1 o'clock. Um, it's afternoon for certain. It's hot. The smell was overwhelming. Just the smell of gunpowder and explosions and bodies in the hot sun, and I'd be devastated by it, ripped apart. shredded, some nailed to tree. And it's kind of like you're wandering in a daze, I guess. You don't really, you're alive, but you're not sure how alive you are. I didn't have any holes in my body. I wasn't bleeding, but certainly I was in a state of not understanding, what had happened, and other than the fact that we were in a giant battle, and that I was still alive. And as that morning and turned into afternoon, other things started happening. The armored personnel carriers were picking up bodies from the battlefield and putting them in this giant hole that was dug by a tank retriever, a big, well, they're 80 tons or thereabouts, and they got a great big plow blade on the front, and it had dug this big hole, and they were throwing bodies in this hole. It looked like a scene out of the Holocaust. And I remember, all of the wounded were in a triage area, and our own guys that died were wrapped in ponchos, and they were taken over by what was established as the heliport and for the medevacs, and of course they're medevacing the seriously wounded before they take the bodies away. And I remember then all this, in this period, there was a lot of activity going on not too far from us. Didn't know this at the time, that was General Westmoreland, and within an hour at the end of the battle or thereabouts, there were 11 stars besides General Westmoreland on the battlefield. And then there was this chaplain. This chaplain came over to my unit, and I shared with you the newspaper clipping and the picture that was taken. The chaplain was out front of us and trying to console us, I guess, from what had happened. And what you don't see in that picture is to the right rear of our group of individuals were the wounded and the bodies in the hot sun. And, you're trying to reflect on what happened. You're still in a state of shock. It was just, it's just surreal. Actually, the picture tells me more about what I was feeling at the time. And I won't go into my reaction to the chaplain's remarks. They weren't really very flattering. He was telling us that all of our men died doing God's work. And I don't know, I was disturbed by the whole thing. That battle was the largest single day loss for the enemy in the entire Vietnam War. We picked up 647 bodies off the battlefield and more than 200 a little deeper into the jungle. Altogether, the death toll for the enemy was over 880. We lost 33 men that morning and 109 wounded. How we managed to survive that, because our perimeter had been penetrated on many areas, but it was Colonel Vesey who had organized the 277 artillery, where he would take one man from each gun for first ready reaction force to fill in holes in these ready reaction forces. And, you can get 3 or 4 of those. And as the gun was put out of service, and a lot of the guns were damaged and put out of service. So, I don't know, 6 or 7 guys on each gun, each 105 howitzer. So there was if it wasn't for him plugging the holes in our perimeter and providing assistance to the weak spots in our perimeter, we would have been surely overrun and all of us would have died. Colonel Vesey was given a Distinguished Service Cross for that day. The unit got a Presidential Unit Citation. Colonel Vesey had been notified a few months earlier that at the end of his tour in Vietnam in 1967, he was going to be retired. He was a World War II hero at Anzio, Battlefield Commission. Um, and here you are 23 years later in Vietnam. He'd been in the military, 26, 27 years, um, and a lieutenant colonel. And so he he was looking towards retirement at the end of that tour. Instead, this battle was so significant that 10 years later, Colonel Vesey was a four-star general. And in 1983, Ronald Reagan named him the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And when he retired in 1986, he was chosen to be the leader of the POW MIA Commission, and he served in that role for 14 years. And it was during that service as the chairman of the POW MIA Commission that he was in Hanoi negotiating with the Vietnamese government about access to some areas to look for, the remains of American soldiers and airmen. Then he got into a conversation with the deputy defense minister in Vietnam, who introduced himself and said to him, he said, General Vesey, you don't know me, but I know you. And he says, I was the commanding general of the 9th Infantry NVA Infantry Division that attacked you at Suoi Tre. And that gentleman went on to inform Colonel Vesey that his unit was 9,000 men strong and that they were fully committed into overrunning and killing every member and destroying everything on that fire support base and going out the other side. And how we managed to survive that is beyond me. I don't know how many of the 9,000 were actually committed to the battle, but I'd say probably more than half. And so our 425 men, artillery and infantry combined, withstood an attack of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 North Vietnamese and hardcore Viet Cong. And to this day, I didn't really know the history about this battle until I went to the 50th reunion in 2017 at Fort Carson, Colorado. That's where the 277 is currently serving, and the 212 infantry. The 322, I think, was disbanded long ago. But when I went to that 53, I had never shared any of these stories, never spoken to anyone who was in that battle after that battle. So that was the first opportunity I had to talk with the other guys that had survived it. And when you're in Vietnam, in any battle, anywhere, all you see is what's in front of you. If there's 400 men on a battlefield in your unit, there's 400 different stories about that battle. And one may not even be similar to the next. You see what's in front of you, how you react to it. So I learned at this 2017 reunion in March of 2017 the specifics of the battle and what happened afterwards. And then when I came home, I was asked to give a keynote address on a Memorial Day talking about Vietnam, representing Vietnam veterans in our community. And I was scared to death to talk about this story that I had lived with all of my life, that even today is emotionally difficult to talk about.
Yeah. Well, take a minute if you need one, but one of the interesting things from our prior conversation was you explained why the Battle of Suoi Tre isn't more talked about, how it's been, to some degree lost to history. Can you for the benefit of our listeners, can you talk a little bit about why Suoi
Yeah,
Tre is not the same kind of household name as Ya Drang or
right.
Hue?
Well, yeah, we were the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, and we were attached to the 25th Infantry Division. So Operation Junction City 2 was basically in the south of Vietnam, where the 4th Infantry Division was in the northern part, in the Central Highlands near Pleiku. You had the 1st Brigade and the 2nd Brigade of the 4th, and the 4th Infantry headquarters in Pleiku. And so the 4th Infantry Division, I went to the 4th Infantry Division annual association last year in Kansas City, Missouri. And at the dinner that night, we had the 4th Infantry Division commander there. We're having this big banquet. I went over to the 4th Infantry Division flag, and I was looking for the battle streamer. I mean, we got a presidential unit citation for that, right? So you'd think that there would be a battle streamer on the flag. And I looked for it, and I couldn't find one. And I was asking the guys there, I said, well, where's the battle streamer for the Battle of Suoi Tre? And he said, well, it hasn't been issued yet. Well, at the 2017 reunion, the 50th reunion at the 4th Infantry Division headquarters in Colorado Springs at Fort Carson, the battle streamer was on the flag for our banquet there. So, it just, and not a, when we got to this annual association here in Kansas City, I'm talking to some of the other guys. There were only 3 of us out of the 140 people who attended that were from the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division that was attached to the 25th. Everybody else that was there was part of the 1st and 2nd Brigades that were in Pleiku. And nobody ever heard, and not a member there had heard about the Battle of Suoi Tre. And so part of that dysfunction there is that the 4th Infantry didn't want to claim that for their archives because it was actually under the command of the 25th. The 25th didn't want to put it in their archives and talk about how heroic it was because we were actually the 4th Infantry that was at the Battle of Suoi Tre. And so it's that kind of tribalism, I guess I call it, not wanting to give or not wanting to celebrate the victory of a unit that isn't part of your unit seemed to have been more the cause of how it got misplaced. I looked for it for years, after the computer started, I mean, when you started having, the ability to search things. I guess this was in the early part of the 2000s. And I would search, I went through the 25th archive and the 4th Infantry archive. There were books out then too. And I could very, very seldom even find a mention of Operation Junction City 2 and the Battle of, I didn't know it was called the Battle of Suoi Tre. I thought it would be the Battle of Fire Support Base Gold or Landing Zone Gold or something of that nature. I didn't know it was the Battle of Suoi Tre until I went to the reunion. And leading up to that visit at the reunion, I saw a posting on the 25th Infantry Division's Facebook page talking about a reunion for the Battle of Suoi Tre, which I didn't recognize, but it was the same date. And I could not imagine that this battle was so big that Westmoreland had come out to the battlefield. There couldn't be 2 of those in the one day. And so I called the organizers of this reunion to ask them about, the reunion and whatnot. And sure enough, it was that battle. And basically the reunions were being hosted by the 212 Infantry and the second battalion 22nd Infantry. Neither one of those 2 units, those battalions, were actually in the battle. They were the units that came to the rescue. And the units that were involved were, like I said before, the 3rd Battalion 22nd Infantry, just A and B Company, and the 277 Artillery. And so when I went to the reunion, there were only, I don't know, 5 or 6 guys there from A Company. And I don't think there was anyone, or maybe 1 or 2 from B Company. And the rest of them were the 277 Artillery and the the 212 infantry and the 222 infantry mechanized. Out of maybe 150 people that attended, there were only maybe 8 of us from the infantry that were actually in the battle. There were quite a few from the artillery that were in the battle. But the majority of the attendees were from the 212 infantry and the 222 infantry. And yeah, I don't know. I was maybe a little bit disappointed by that. But they seem to have got, more of the acclaim than the actual soldiers that fought the battle.
Yeah. So
Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
before we move on, and we need to move on from Suoi Tre, but before we do, that first reunion you went to in March of 2017, was there anything else you learned about the battle that came as a surprise to you?
Well, I learned about the history of General Vesey, which I didn't know before. Um, I did learn quite a bit in the sense that the battle that they described in the after action report for the presidential unit citation, I didn't recognize that battle when I read that after action report. And one of the things I learned from talking with all the other guys is that if there were 425 of us on that fire support base that day, there were 425 different stories, and basically those stories really didn't sound much alike. And the reason for that is that, it's like I was saying earlier, you see the battle that's in front of you, and you see it from your own emotions, and you see it from your own anxiety levels and your own interpretation of what's in front of you. And everybody has a different anxiety level, I'll call it, I guess. Uh, Everybody has a different way of dealing with their own fears and demons, and you see these things from the perspective of your narrow vision. And that's kind of like a horse going down Fifth Avenue with blinders on. You're only going to see what's in front of you. And I guess maybe that was what I learned the most, is that the battle that I recall isn't necessarily the battle that the others who were at the reunion recall. There's a difference in them. And I had to be able to finally understand that my recollections are not necessarily those of the others. And the other part of that is recognizing that for a few brief moments, I don't know how long this was, for a few brief moments, I fought alongside, even though I was just unwrapping rounds to fire, I fought alongside a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who, in my looking back at history, is one of the heroes of my life. He was a hero at Anzio in World War II, earned a Distinguished Service Cross and a Battlefield Commission. He was a hero at the Battle of Suoi Tre, Distinguished Service Cross, and his future to rise up to becoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It's an amazing history that I had this tangential experience with, and in looking at it in hindsight, I'm just absolutely overwhelmed by it. That story. Each time I recall these stories, there's always something different that pops into your head that maybe you didn't think about before. In this past couple of months, maybe the past 3 months or so, I've had to tell this story more times than I think I've ever thought about it in the lead up to us bringing the Wall That Heals to Hilo and to Hawaii for its first visit. I've been giving these talks to civic groups and Rotary clubs and the like for the last few months. And each time I tell the story, some new recollection that maybe I had overlooked, or maybe is reminded by something else I touch on. Um, but just my own participation in the looking back at it.
Yeah.
There's only two people in this world that I really admire and look up to, and that's General Vesey. And I don't know if you remember Max Cleland.
Oh yeah.
Um, when Jimmy Carter was president, Max was the administrator of the VA. Went on to become a senator from the state of Georgia. Max lost two legs and an arm in Vietnam. And how that man rose up to even going forward in his life always amazed me.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the very first,
Max,
actually the very first episode that we did, episode 1 of Echoes of the Vietnam War, features an interview with Everett Alvarez, who was a longest
uh,
serving POW. And I remember
right.
very clearly Mr. Alvarez talking about Max Cleland. And it was, you're not the only one who looks up to him. That's for sure.
Oh, I admire Max greatly. The same with General Vesey. General Vesey was a soldier. He was an enlisted man. He served in every rank in the military except for first sergeant and sergeant major. The only man ever to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that came from a battlefield commission.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Just an amazing man.
Yeah. Well,
And
let's talk about Hawaii, right? So
okay.
you're an instrumental part, some might argue the driving force of bringing the wall that heals to Hilo. Um, why can you talk a little bit about why it's important to you personally to have that in Hilo, and what sort of connect the dots for me, for our listeners, about why Hawaii is significant in the history of the Vietnam War and your experience with Hawaii.
Yeah. The first time I saw the wall, I went to Washington, D.C. in 1998 with my lady friend to visit her mother because we were going to bring her mother from Arlington, Virginia to Oregon to live. And I remember going to the wall on that visit. And one of the things that was overwhelming to me was that when I got within sight of the wall, something overcame me. It was like a magnetic force that kept me away from it. Um, and for 2 or 3 hours, I stood off in the distance and walked around and would just look back at it. And one of the one of the things that I realized was keeping me away from it was that I was afraid of my own emotions. I was afraid of getting up close to that memory because I had never thought, I buried Vietnam for over 30 years. Uh, Nobody around me in my living environment, in my community, knew that I was a Vietnam veteran. And I was a rather prominent business owner, builder, real estate developer in the San Juan Islands of Washington State. I lived in Friday Harbor, small community. I was from California. That's where I started. I was a fireman and a paramedic in the Bay Area. I built a few houses in a waterfront community out in the Delta region of San Francisco, San Joaquin Rivers, um, and Discovery Bay. And when I got injured in the fire department, I moved up to the San Juan Islands to build a marina. Uh, and so I built this marina boatyard called Shipyard Cove Marina in Friday Harbor. And while I lived there, I was involved in sailing and fishing and adventuring. And I did not let anybody know that I was a Vietnam veteran. And so Cindy was an executive with Nike down in Portland, and I would commute back and forth to Portland. So we went to Arlington, Washington, D.C. area to bring her mother out to Oregon to live. And so wandering around the wall, um, it it made me have to unbury Vietnam. I had to dig it up. And I finally managed to get down there next to the wall, to the panel where all those guys are. And it was an interesting experience because I didn't know how the wall was organized. And so I went through the directory book looking for anybody who died on March the 21st, 1967. When I found that name and what panel it was on, I went down to that panel and stood in front of that panel, got to that date on the wall, the 19th and the 21st of March, 67, and started reading the names. And familiarity with the names started to, emotionally affect me. And I struggled to read those names and stay composed. I didn't want to sit there and start bawling in front of hundreds of people standing in front of the wall. That was my introduction to the wall. And so that that visit ended. We went back to Oregon and Friday Harbor, went about my business, and I was trying to keep Vietnam buried, and I couldn't. And of course, then we ended up with um, the politics of invading Iraq after 9/11, and that just uncovered everything in my past and brought all those emotions to the surface. And I went through a really bad period from late 2001. And the 2002 midterm election was a terrible experience because they trashed Max Cleland. Max Cleland was running for re-election as a senator from the state of Georgia, and they superimposed Max Cleland's picture over Osama bin Laden and said he was a terrorist sympathizer. I came unglued. I mean, I was just emotionally a wreck. They're going to crash a dedicated veteran who lost two legs and an arm. How dare you? That that probably uncovered the PTSD and everything else I had been struggling with for decades. And I couldn't find any help. I went to the VA and felt like I was dismissed. Um, here, fill out these papers, and if we think we can help you, we'll send you a note, kind of a thing. And I'm thinking to myself, it took me a long time to get the gumption up, the inner strength to even go and ask for help. Veterans don't ask for help. Majority of us, we're tough. We'll weather it out. And so that period in my life, 2001 through about 2005, 6, 7, were just emotionally a wreck. I'm still deeply affected. In 2004, I saw a piece of property listed on the internet here in Hawaii. And I immediately called the broker. Just the pictures of it, I knew that that's where I needed to be for some reason. Called the broker up, and it was already in escrow. Somebody else had cash offer on it. And I said, well, call me if it falls apart. Never got called. And so I struggled for a few more years. In 2009, I knew I needed to change my life. I had to do something. So I came over here to Hawaii, to the Big Island. And I spent 2 months looking around for something. I had no idea. All I knew is that the pictures of the property I would have bought sight unseen. I was looking for something that would make me feel like that, knowing that that's where I needed to be. So for 2 months, I went around this island with various different real estate brokers, and they'd all ask me, well, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? And I would describe the pictures of the one that got away in 2004. And I could not find anything. I looked at over 200 pieces of property. I couldn't find anything. Um, and so next to the last day, I was going to fly out, go back to home the next day. I was with this broker I'd been with a number of times, and he was going to show me some stuff that he'd already sold to see if I could find something in that realm that might be what I'm looking for. And so I did not know where this piece of property was that I had seen in the past. And so we're out driving around. I had no idea where on the island it was. So we're coming up this road and we're going up what we call Malka, which is up mountain from the ocean. And I saw the tops of these palm trees in the distance. And I don't know if you've ever had an experience like a deja vu thing, but I started getting anxiety ridden. My heart started pounding. My hands were getting sweaty. Um, I felt anxious. There was something going on, and I had no idea. I thought maybe you having a heart attack. What's going on? And so we kept going up the hill, and all of a sudden we came to the front of this piece of property. And I'm looking down this piece of property. There's this wide grassy avenue lined with palms, and it's like 600-700 feet long that you can see. And I looked at it, and it was the exact picture of the one that got away. And I looked at the broker and I said, what do you know about this property? And he was saying, oh, he says, I think a friend of mine helped him buy this, and he's a client of hers and whatnot. I said, and I looked at the broker and I said, this is the one that got away. I mean, I didn't know that, but whatever it was that I was feeling at that moment, I knew that this is where I was supposed to be. Sure enough, it was the same piece of property. And he called his friend, this other real estate broker, and asked if the current owner wanted to sell it. And she said, "Well, yeah." And this is 2008, 2009 when the economy was falling off a cliff. Um, and so um, she called back and said, "Yeah, yeah, he'd like to sell it, and he'll take his dogs and go down to the park for a walk. And he said he'll leave the gate open. You can go in and take a look around." So a few minutes later, we saw this car go by with a couple dogs in it, and we pulled into the driveway and parked on the driveway. And I got out and I walked around. It's a 13-acre um, piece of property that was architecturally, designed by a landscape architect from Australia. It's like a giant park. Um, what I had felt when I first saw the pictures in 2004, and what I'm even doing today, is that I wanted to develop a vocational training retreat thing. Basically, when I started, it was for Vietnam veterans, for at-risk youth, because I was a troubled kid. That's why I joined the Army on my 17th birthday. Um, and and since then, it's developed into a wider venue of um, groups that I would like to help. But I pictured a vocational training program that would teach at-risk youth, PTSD veterans, and the like to become landscape maintenance contractors, and learn business skills. One of the things that I did in my entire professional life was built businesses. I built Shipyard Cove Marina and San Juan shipyards in the San Juan Islands. I built a few condo projects in the Seattle area. Um, I was instrumental in building a Lincoln Financial Center in Bellevue, Washington, off I-90. Uh, I got involved in building a lot of stuff um, during the uh, 80s and 90s. Um, and I kind of walked away from that. We got into the 2000s. And I was needing something for myself. I was needing a sanctuary. a place where, I could let all this stuff that was clouding my emotions, to do something different. And one of the things that I realized along the way was that I felt very guilty, that I survived because everyone in my platoon, this platoon that I was assigned to in the A Company, 322 Infantry, every one of them was drafted. They didn't ask to be in Vietnam. I did. I came home without any holes in my body. Only 17 of those guys out of that platoon came home whole. And I felt guilty about that. And I knew that I needed to do something to honor the guys that died. And so my entire period of time here in Hawaii County, I've been here 14 years now, has been um, centered around helping veterans. Um, After I gave the keynote address on Memorial Day 2017, I was asked by the mayor if I would want to join or apply to join the Veterans Cemetery Committee. And I politely said, no, I don't want to be on a cemetery committee. And I just casually asked him, I said, why do you have a cemetery committee and you don't have a veterans committee? Don't you want to help the living veterans? I mean, if you're so involved with the cemeteries, you can't do much for them except mow the grass and keep it pretty. I said, what can we do for the living veterans? Because I know I had been troubled for a lot of years. And he just looked at me and he said, well, he says, you can't change anything unless you belong to it. And so um, that was Mayor Harry Kemp. And so I applied to join the Veterans Cemetery Committee. And my application was, then sent by the mayor to the county council for confirmation. And when I went to the first committee meeting, it was newly reconstituted because the previous mayor had let it die. And so everybody there is kind of new, and I didn't know anybody, and nobody there knew me. And so they were bantying around, well, we need a chairman, we need a vice chairman, to lead this committee. And so a lot of these older guys, they were talking about, well, who's going to be the chairman, And we have a corporate counsel lawyer that sits in all of our committee meetings. And he looked at me because he saw that I was looking around because I didn't know anybody really. I knew one other person there, and that was the retired colonel who asked me to give the keynote address on Memorial Day. She was in the first graduating class with women out of West Point. Her name is Deborah Lewis, retired Army colonel. And the corporate counsel lawyer that sits in with us looked at me and he says, you can nominate yourself. I'm not one to want to nominate myself for anything. But anyway, so I did. I stood up and I announced that I wanted to be considered for the chairmanship of this committee. And the reason is that I think we needed to expand the Veterans Cemetery Committee to be a Veterans Advisory Committee for the council and the mayor's office to talk about all of the things that affected veterans in our county. And so I was elected chairman. And within 6 months to a year, I don't know exactly how long it took, I submitted a letter to the mayor saying that we needed to change the committee to an advisory committee for all veterans issues. And he agreed, and we got the council to change all the statutes and the codes. And so within a year, we had the entire committee changed to a veterans advisory committee. And that kind of started, but I had already been asked to join the board of Hawaii Island Veterans Memorial, Inc., which is a development agency, a 501c3. And we have two projects that we're working on. One is a housing project, an affordable housing project for senior veterans and widows of veterans. It's 92 units of low-income affordable housing. that now is about 70% constructed, and we expect to be into occupancy in June of this next year. Now, that's pretty remarkable for a group of veterans and community leaders to actually be able to pull something off like that. It's a $50+ million housing complex. I was originally asked to be a board member, then I became the vice chair of the board. And when the chairman decided he wanted to retire, he's about 85 now. I was voted in as the chairman of Hawaii Island Veterans Memorial. And Hawaii Island Veterans Memorial is the 501c3 that is the umbrella organization promoting and bringing the wall that heals to Hilo. Now, the story about how the wall even became a possibility for us was one of the other veterans' wives that I've known for some time, Teresa Fuata. Her father was a Vietnam veteran, 3-tour Vietnam veteran, and he was I believe he was either a first sergeant or a sergeant major. He had died, and he was being inducted into the In Memory program. So Teresa was in Washington, D.C., Father's Day of 2022, while her dad was being inducted into the In Memory program. And she had a chance meeting with Cynthia Long of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, talking about the traveling wall that heals. Now, I did vaguely hear about it. A friend of mine had worked as a volunteer for it once when it was displayed in, I think, Eureka, California. And this was probably back in the late 80s or no, that had been in the late 90s, maybe the early 2000s, because it didn't start touring, I think, until 96. Anyway, so Teresa comes back to Hawaii County, and I got an email from her that there was going to be a video conference with Cynthia Long and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, and that asked if I would join the video conference. And so I sat in on this video conference, and the whole discussion of this video conference was, where in Oahu, where in Honolulu can we bring this wall to display it? And I sat silently through this video conference. I mean, I wasn't the instigator of it, so I didn't want to interject myself, because I do have a tendency to interject myself in things. I didn't want to step on anyone's toes. And so I just quietly listened. A few weeks later, I was invited to a second video conference. And it started the same way. Where in Honolulu are we going to put this wall? Where can we display it? And after 4 or 5 minutes of this, at the very beginning, that's the way it started, that's the way it opened up. I kind of interjected, and I said, "Whoa!" I said, "Stop!" I said, "Look, the majority of us here in Teresa Fuata, we're all from the Big Island. We're all from Hilo. Why are we talking about Honolulu? Let's talk about Hilo. And if we work to bring this wall to Hilo, I'll put a sizable amount of money on the table to help make it happen." Well, in our society, money tends to talk louder than a lot of other things. And that got everyone's attention, because I was willing to put $10,000 on the table. And it was more about, that's an awful cheap price to honor the guys that I served with who didn't come home. Now, I'm not rich. I'm probably better off than most. But to me, it just seemed like such a worthwhile thing to do. And so I've become very vocal about this. And here's the thing about Hawaii. Hawaii had more to do with the Vietnam War than any other state. Not only is it a small state in population, but it's also a state that sent a full division to Vietnam, the 25th Infantry Division. But also, a great many, damn near half of all the Vietnam veterans that took an R&R came to Hawaii for their R&R because they wanted to see their families, their wives, their children, brothers, sisters, girlfriends, because they weren't sure that they were going to come home in the end. And so somewhere between a third of their tour and half of their tour, they get an R&R. And the first thing they want to do is they want to touch someone from their family. They want to have an experience that reminds them that there's something to go home to. And I myself, I took two R&Rs and I came to Hawaii. So I know what that feeling is. And it just seemed to me that, here this wall that heals has been traveling the nation. It just finished its 28th year. It's been to something like 750 communities. It's been in every state 14 to 18 times. It's never been to Hawaii. And as we've experienced over this last year plus, it's a very daunting and very complicated experience to raise the money because we have to pay shipping. It's costing us $85,000 for shipping. No other communities ever had to pay a shipping cost because, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, they dragged this trailer around the country behind a truck. And the site fee covers the travel around the country behind the truck. And so it was an overwhelming experience for us to undertake this adventure because we had to raise $125,000 or $130,000 in order to make it happen, where most communities can probably raise $25,000 and they can make it work. And so after that second video conference, when we started getting serious about talking about it coming here, we connected with San Luis Obispo, California, and I participated with their leadership, Morgan Boyd from the Office of Veteran Services there in San Luis Obispo County. And I sat in on their video conferences for the better part of 6 months. And then when they displayed the wall in March of this year, myself and Teresa Fuada and her husband, Ben, all traveled to San Luis Obispo. We spent 8-9 days there helping them display the wall and to get a firsthand experience of what it was like to do this. And we became more indebted and more obligated. Yeah, the effort to bring this wall to Hawaii, as opposed to what it took San Luis Obispo to bring it back to San Luis Obispo for its second time. It had been there in 2018 and it was there again in 2023, is the overwhelming cost that Hawaii, because we're out here in the middle of the Pacific, and the Wall That Heals educational van is a non-conforming shipping container. Everything that ships over here to Hawaii is basically a 40-foot container. And so this 53-foot van that's wider than a 40-foot container and much taller than a 40-foot container doesn't conform to the shipping standards of today. And so the shipping is overwhelmingly expensive. So it's $85,000. And no other community in the country has ever had to pay a shipping cost. And so it made coming to Hawaii extremely difficult. And so the more we talked about it and the more we mulled this over and started looking for how we're going to raise this money, I kind of wanted to propose to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund to give us until the middle of December to raise the money, keep us on your schedule. And if we can't raise the money by mid-December, we'll let you know and we'll just cease trying to do it. And during that period of time, oh, I forgot exactly when it was. Maybe it was in August or so of this year. In one of our organizational meetings, our director of Parks and Recreation, which is the largest single department in the county government, they administer and take care of over 300 different park locations and areas that the county is responsible for maintaining, including our veterans memorial cemeteries. The director, who's also a veteran, as well as the deputy director, is a veteran, both Maurice Messina and Michelle Hirayashi. They came into our meeting and said, we are going to make a commitment to cover the cost of the shipping. Wow. That was like a shot in the arm. I was overwhelmed that this was really going to happen. Once they made that announcement, and thanks to the mayor as well, for following up and making sure that that did happen. That would have never happened. We would have never been able to bring the wall to Hawaii if it hadn't been for the county and Department of Rec and whatnot stepping up to help us. And for all of us that are involved, there's on the organizing committee itself, there's I don't know, there's 4 or 5 of us that are Vietnam combat veterans. My co-chair, co-host, Jim Hussey, was a retired Special Forces Sergeant Major. And I think he did 5 or 6 tours in Vietnam. Um, Several others, prominent members of our committee, are Vietnam veterans. And there are people I've known ever since I moved here. We used to have a First Wednesday group, which was a member from every, American Legion, VFW, Purple Heart, combat veterans, whatnot. We'd all get together on the first Wednesday of every month and we'd talk about what each group was doing, and about, updating us on the Veterans Day Parade or our housing project with Hawaii Island Veterans Memorial. And some of the things that we would discuss in the Veterans Advisory Committee for the mayor and the council. And so, as we got into September, October, we knew that this event was really going to happen, and we started to get, more excited about it all the time. And we've tried to bring in other islands. We tried to get Oahu to get a group together. We tried to get Kauai to get a group together. And after we were assured that the wall was coming to Hawaii by Tim Tetz, I was in contact with some of my veteran friends on Maui. And when we let them know that the wall was coming to Hilo, one of the members in Maui, Jana Lively Hohen, she was very instrumental in the wall of faces. She helped put, like, I think 14,000 pictures to the 58,281 names on the wall. And so she was very interested and whatnot. And she was kind of disappointed that, Maui wasn't included. And so I went to bat with Tim. I stressed the point that we couldn't bring this all the way to Hawaii and only display it in one site. And that I put the entire program on the line and saying that, look, we need to add Maui to this. Maui needs this wall as well. We need to have more than one site. And so Maui was added to the display site, the display schedule. And then, of course, the history of what happened in Maui with big fire, the devastating loss of life. And it's basically put a huge, huge damper on the enthusiasm in Maui. But I firmly believe, and I'm going to help Maui every way I can, I firmly believe that Maui needs this to bring some kind of honor and memorial to the veterans of Hawaii and the veterans of Maui, to continue, helping them and their mayor stood up and offered to pay half of the transportation for the wall, which made it certainly more palatable for us. Uh, but our group is dedicated to making this the absolute standard for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund on how we display this wall. And I firmly believe that we're going to more than double whatever your average visitations are for the displays of the wall, because it's never coming back to Hawaii. This is a one-time, never to be repeated display of the wall. And one of the things also that's real prominent is that we all have to realize that 90% of the veterans who served in Vietnam do not have the financial ability to go to Washington, D.C. to see the wall. And I'm just very thankful that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund built this traveling wall. The Vietnam veterans, when I was in San Luis Obispo, as an example, I went down to the wall 3 nights in a row at 1:30 in the morning. And on all 3 nights, there were veterans there at 1:30 in the morning. They didn't want to be part of the daytime rush. They wanted some private time in their mind with the memory of the guys they served with. And I remember this one night I went down there, and it was a terrible weather in San Luis Obispo. It's the worst weather they had there in 100 years. I remember going down there middle of the night, and it was very cold that night, and there was a dew on the wall, and the wall was kind of glowing. And so I'm standing off back by the educational van, a couple, maybe 100 yards away from the wall. And it was if the wall had come alive and was looking at the veterans who were there looking at the wall. I mean, it was just a surreal feeling that I had. And of course, my unit probably has 400 names on that wall. Just that 2 day period, we had 55 guys on that wall on March 19th and March 21st of 67.
So, but yeah,
So for me,
but can I just ask a clarifying question there?
yeah,
So
sure.
I'm looking at Wikipedia, which is, the world's worst reference for things like this. But it says on the Battle of Suoi Tre, it says 36 Americans killed. But I'm guessing that doesn't take into account the those crews who died on the six choppers.
Yeah, that doesn't include the March 19th assault on the LZ.
Got it.
And there were 28 who died that day. Um, yeah, I agree. Wikipedia is not the most authoritative, um, but in any way, this was just 2 days in the year I was there. Um, and when I think about all the other firefights and never did we have another battle anywhere near that size, but we had quite a few. Um, I just think about all of those guys that I knew, and they were all young guys. Like I said, my platoon, they were all my age. I think 20 and 21 years of age. They all got drafted in December of 65 and January of 66. They all got on a ship and went to Vietnam together on, I believe it was the USS Patch. Um, left out of Tacoma, I think in September of 66. They arrived in Vietnam, I think in October of 66. They didn't make their way up into Dao Tiang at Camp Rainier, where we were based, until late in December. So when I joined the unit, they were pretty new at Dao Tiang. Dao Tiang base camp, Camp Rainier was just completed, and they were starting to bring units in there. And it was kind of like a triangle between Cu Chi, Tay Ninh, and Dao Tiang. We were actually on the Michelin rubber plantation. And our brigade headquarters was in an old, big French colonial plantation building. Uh, the 212 Battalion was also headquartered in one of those. We had an above ground swimming pool that was something like 12 or 14 feet deep, had a 10-meter tower. This is all above ground, you know. The dressing rooms were at ground level, and you went up this big stairway to the pool. It was like a it was a minimum of 25-meter pool. Uh, it was huge. Um, so it was kind of a surreal experience being in Dao Tiang with all these big old French colonial buildings, and then we're being choppered out into the jungle fighting this war. But yeah, that uh, just that memory alone, and that was my first tour. You know, on the night that I had gone home on leave for Christmas in 1967 between the end of my first tour and the beginning of my second tour. And when I got back to Dao Tiang and I'm clearing out of Dao Tiang, I'm going up to be port security at Cameron Bay. Um, I left Dao Tiang on the afternoon of the Tet Offensive. I got on a chopper about 4:30 in the afternoon and um, went down to Benoit Air Base, and I was going to catch a C-130 to go up to Cameron Bay. And I I remember our plane to Cameron Bay was supposed to leave about 5:30 in the morning. But that night, as we were down there in Benoit, you could hear something happening. You know, the uh, you're always hearing artillery all the time, what they call the H&I fire, harassment and interdictory fire. Uh, and but this night was different in the sense that not only was the H&I fire going on, but then it started to become more intense. And then you started to hear other rounds. And there's a difference between outgoing and incoming, believe me. And you started hearing incoming rounds. And this was approaching, 9, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night when the H&I fire started to increase. And about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, um, we were starting to see the explosions on the perimeter of some of the taxiways and the runways, 300 or so yards away from us, and maybe a little bit more. And jet fighters are starting to take off in multiples, and you could hear the activity at Benoit Air Base was just becoming intense. And when we finally understood we didn't know the magnitude of what was happening. We just knew that the base was under attack. And the longer we got, our C-130 was parked over in this revetment, and there was a loadmaster there and a crew chief, and we didn't know anything else about what was going on, and so some of us went over and talked to the crew chief about, is this plane going to be able to get off and get out of here? And they were doubtful, because the runways were closed to everything but fighter aircraft, and attack aircraft. And so finally, it was about 5 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, and the intensity of the attack was getting closer and closer. And finally, I don't know whether or not they decided to do this themselves or whether or not they were ordered to get that plane out of the area or whatnot. There was a hole in the traffic, and the loadmaster came over, and there was about 40 of us or so at this, I don't know, replacement or transit center, or whatever it was. And so we were instructed that they were going to fire up the aircraft and they were going to taxi it around with the ramp down, and then when they turned to go down the taxiway, the crew chief and the loadmaster were going to give us the signal. We're supposed to come running with our bags and get up on the ramp and run to the forward part of the aircraft and throw our bags down on the floor and lay down and grab a hold of something. That's what we were instructed. And so all that happened, and the C-130 was starting to taxi, and we all ran into the back of the C-130 and threw ourselves down on the floor and grabbed on, they got these things where they secure cargo on the floor and the decks. We're hanging on to that. And the pilots of this C-130, it was almost like you were in a go-kart, and making turns. I thought the wingtips were going to hit the ground. And they managed to get out to a runway. And I don't know if you've ever seen a C-130 when it makes one of those jet assist takeoffs. I saw demonstrations of it with the Blue Angels. They have a support aircraft that travels with the Blue Angels. It's a C-130 that does that demonstration. But being on board one when it does that is another experience altogether. And it's kind of like you were being shot in a rocket almost. And I recall you're not going to feel safe until you're above about 15, 18,000 feet, because the arc trajectory of the bigger mortar rounds can be 12, 13, 14,000 feet. And so I remember the pilot finally coming on the intercom once we were up above altitude that we were out of the danger zone and we were on our way to Cameron Bay. But that was the Tet Offensive. That was the opening salvo of the Tet Offensive, and I was escaping. So the minute I got to Cameron Bay, I was picked up and taken down to a tugboat in Cameron Bay, the LT-77 from the 97th Transportation Company. And they delivered 100 cases of hand grenades and put them on the fantail of this big tug. And we patrolled the harbor for better part of a month, dumping hand grenades in the water as depth charges to keep the sapper squads from putting satchel charges and stuff on the hulls of ships and stuff. So that was an interesting experience as well. But my tenure here in Hawaii and my experience and my advocacy for bringing the wall here is the highlight of my entire life. It is such an honor to be involved with this really magnificent group of people who are helping to bring the wall to Hawaii. The dedication of this group is just amazing to me. And nothing I've ever done in the past has as much emotional impact on me as honoring the veterans who were lost, especially the veterans that I served with who were lost. And the greatest thing I can do is help bring this wall to Hawaii so that the veterans who can't go to the wall in DC have a chance to see that wall here and to be able to visit it at whatever time of the night or the early morning or the middle of the day, whenever it's comfortable for them, and to have the privacy to see it in their own emotional space. It's just it's a reward I can't possibly even describe.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're emotional now, wait until you are actually standing in front of it. But you've already done that because you were involved in San Luis Obispo, so you know exactly
Well,
what's.
I stayed away from the wall in San Luis Obispo. I stayed up by the educational van and talking to the veterans who came to visit the wall more than anything else, because I knew it was going to be difficult for me. And I know it's going to be supremely difficult here. I volunteered for a number of shifts to be at the wall in the middle of the night, in the early morning hours, uh, just to add my part, to the volunteer corps.
Yeah.
But, you know, we have this one opportunity to do this for the veterans of the state of Hawaii. I would like to say that we have multiple opportunities like most states, and I mean, if it's being displayed 2 counties over, you can spend a couple hours and drive over there and see it. Here, you can't come from Maui County to Hawaii without getting on an airplane. you can't come from Kauai without getting on an airplane, going to Honolulu, then going from Honolulu to the Big Island. There's no direct flights from Kauai to Hawaii County. Um, so the difficulty of getting the other veterans from Hawaii and Oahu to either the Big Island or to Maui to see the display on either of the two sites is going to be difficult. And that's the other part of what we're doing. We're raising money, and we're trying to get Hawaiian Airlines and Southwest, which now flies into Hawaii. We're trying to get them to offer free flight coupons like the honor flights do,
Sure.
to help bring any veteran from these other islands to the Big Island or to Maui, to view the wall.
Does Alaska
Um,
fly around the Hawaiian Islands at all?
no, they fly in and out of the Hawaiian Islands. They fly from the mainland. They don't fly in between the islands.
I see. Yeah.
Uh, but Alaska Airlines is buying Hawaiian Airlines.
Okay. Well, that might work in your favor.
Yeah, no, that won't happen for another year, but that was disclosed here about 2 or 3 weeks ago. That they're gonna join in. They're gonna still operate separately as Hawaiian Airlines and Alaska Airlines, but they're gonna be connected.
I see.
But
Well, Michael,
no, those are the only two.
so before we wrap up, um, if you don't mind, if you have the time and the energy, I'd love to hear you talk about your experiences in Hawaii during the war and how those experiences connect to your eventual settling there.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. The first R&R I took to Hawaii was while I was in the combat unit, A Company 322 and the 212. I took this R&R, and I got to Hawaii, and it wasn't because I wanted to be in Hawaii. I hopped on a plane and I went to San Francisco. I wasn't supposed to. You're told you got to stay in Hawaii, but no, I got on a plane and I went to the mainland. I had to take care of some business. My ex-wife was trying to divorce me and wanting, you know, alimony and all this stuff, and I just needed to. I needed to go to the mainland, so I took that R&R to Hawaii, got on a jet, and went to San Francisco. The second time I went on R&R to Hawaii was in July of 1968. And actually, I was getting real close to being the end of my tour and going home. I went there for the July 4th weekend, or July 4th week, 1968. And I'd always been told by my grandmother, um, she had a sister that lived in Honolulu. I never met her before. There were the three Eaton sisters out of the Seattle area. They were actually related to the Foss tugboat family in some fashion. But in any event, um, so I was staying at Fort DeRussy in Honolulu, and I called my great aunt. I looked in the phone book, I found her phone number, and I called her. And she'd been living in Honolulu since 1929, and she was married to an oral surgeon, a guy named Pete Wilson. And so I called her, and she invited me over to dinner. I was surprised she even knew who I was, at first. But apparently she knew everything about me. I knew very little about her. And so I went to dinner that night. It was just one of the most magical experiences I've ever had with an older, relative that I'd never known before. She was an Auntie Mame kind of character, if you know the story of Auntie Mame and the movie and plays. That's for an older generation, I
Oh
guess.
yeah, colorful.
Um, yeah, but she was more than colorful. Yeah. And Pete Wilson had a rather colored history himself. He was connected to, the old surfers in Honolulu before the war, World War II, and the Clipper Cup sailing yacht races in the Honolulu area, etc. So anyway, we went to Maui July 4th weekend, and or I was in Honolulu, and I went to dinner with my great aunt, and she told me to pack my bag. She'd pick me up the next morning, And so I packed my bags. She came down to Fort DeRussy, picked me up, took me to the airport, and we went to Maui. And Maui was where her youngest son lived with his family in Makawao, Maui. And he had a feed and grain store, and he was connected to the Baldwin family that owned the Hakalot area, half of Maui or whatever they owned at the time. And so Makawao has a rodeo July 4th weekend, and my cousin, the youngest son of my great aunt Dode, said to me, he says, "Yeah, combat veteran from the jungles of Vietnam. Hell, you can ride a bucket bronco in the Makawao rodeo." So he put me on a damn horse in the rodeo. I lasted about 3 seconds. But anyway, I was introduced to Maui and his circle of friends, and they had polo ponies and all that kind of stuff. And that became my second family. And from then on, I've always come back to Maui on many occasions. I had a place on Kauai for a short period of time, 4 years. And I would spend a lot of vacation time on Kauai. I helped a friend take a big sailing yacht to Kauai. We did whale watches and sunset cruises and stuff like that out in the Willy Harbor. And I would do that in the wintertime to escape the San Juan Islands cold winters. But I knew long ago, just from my constant contact, on not only with my time in Kauai, but my time in 1968 coming to visit Maui, and I went to Maui on vacation, almost every year for a long time. That I needed to move to the Hawaiian Islands, um, and whatever it was that I felt was the magnet draw for me, I really couldn't put my finger on. I just knew that I needed to be here. Uh, it was that experience in 2004, seeing a piece of property on the internet that really had a huge magnet draw to me. And then in 2009, finding that same piece of property during all the chaos of the foreclosures and the economic madness within the United States. And the other connecting story there is that the mortgage on this property that the previous owner had was held by Lehman Brothers Bank out of New York, which was the bank that was the first bankruptcy of a bank that was allowed to happen rather than a takeover that caused all that chaos in September of 2008. And it took me almost a year um, to make it happen, to close the escrow and actually take possession of this property. But I knew I needed to be here, and I wasn't not going to let this fail. There was just something about having to be here, that I needed to be here, not only to resurrect myself and to, do something to recognize the gift I was given on March 21st in 1967 to survive that battle. I just think it was a miraculous experience to even survive that battle, even though there were a lot of guys that survived it. To have an entire platoon full of drafted soldiers and have so many of them not survive, and me escaping Vietnam without even so much as a wound or anything in all of that time, I just knew that I owed something. Just in their memory. It's like right outside my front door here. I wish I could show you a picture of it. I have 33 Royal Caribbean palms, all in a formation like soldiers, all lined up and dressed up. There were 33 young men that died that morning in the Battle of Suoi Tre. Every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day, I go out there with my weed eater and I dress up around the bottoms of them and clear a little clearing around them. And I generally go out there each one of those mornings and while they're all cleaned up and with a cup of coffee and whatnot, I go out there and I talk to them like they're the soldiers that were lost.
Hmm. I'd, if you have a chance, you know, in the coming days, I know you're really busy because the wall that heals is going to be there pretty soon. But if you have a
We're
chance,
31 days.
yeah, I'd love to see a picture of those 33 palms, or you know,
Yeah, this whole place is just a magical place. There's 800 palms, about 500 fruit trees, and it's all, manicured, and it's like a giant park.
mm,
Um,
sounds
and
amazing.
my intent is to develop this as a retreat and a vocational training center to leave in a charitable trust in perpetuity.
Mm, that's a beautiful gift.
It's for all those guys that I served with who didn't get a life after that day.
Right.
And I've been fortunate because it was 56 years and 9 months ago,
Yeah, every time I talk to
yesterday.
you, you know exactly how many days, like to the day, how long it's been since Suoi Tre.
Well, it is. It's 56 years and 9 months ago today.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm 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 just it's always overwhelming to me. Um, when I think back on those days, how many, 58,281 names on that wall. That's not talking about the hundreds of thousands who were wounded, um, and the many more hundreds of thousands who came home with emotional distress and a time bomb of Agent Orange poisoning
Mm.
and the like. I lost two friends here this last year that were really prominent in the county for what they did for veterans. Um, One of them was a first sergeant, Emil Weary, who just died, who was instrumental in building the Korean War monument here in Hilo, and Dan Kama, who started our Veterans Day parade.
Mm.
Both succumbed to uh, their frailties of uh, Agent Orange in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that's a constant reminder all the time, how many guys we lost during COVID. We lost 29 of our senior veterans at our old soldiers home
Yeah.
uh,
Well, you know,
through COVID.
you talk about the time bomb of Agent Orange exposure. You know, I think sometimes the emotional damage is also a time bomb. I mean, I've talked to veterans
Oh,
who
it is. Yeah.
bottled it
I
up,
mean,
and
just for
you know,
myself,
40 years later, it just came exploding out of them. And I, you know, and I
right?
just wonder, you know, if we had done a better job at the time of helping them heal, you know, would that have come out in the way that it did decades
Well,
later?
I think the difference between the World War II veterans. I remember I went to the movie Saving Private Ryan when it first came out. And in front of me were two rows of World War II veterans that came from, I don't know, some organization or maybe an old soldiers home in the Portland area or something like that. And I remember at the start of that movie, the intensity of the start of that movie, to a man, they all got up and walked out. They could not sit through that first 28 minutes of that movie. It's just intense. I struggled through it. I mean, I actually had to close my eyes and try to not visualize some of the stuff I saw during that 28 minutes. It was intense. My anxiety level was shooting through the roof. And I remember they came back in and sat down and watched the rest of the movie about a half an hour later. But I had the opportunity to talk to some of them afterwards. Um, and I was amazed that here it was, oh, I forgot how many years earlier. It was over 70 or 70 years or whatever it was after World War II, that they were still very affected by that. But the difference for them was that they came home to a country that was very thankful.
Mhm.
They came home to parades and ticker tape parades and pretty girls on the street rushing up to kiss all the returning soldiers and sailors, and the honor that they were bestowed upon for their service in World War II. And the career guys that stayed in the military, you're around other people who experienced the same thing you did. So, and it's like some of my Vietnam veteran friends here who were career soldiers who retired from the military. They had a different experience and they have a different reflection back on Vietnam because they stayed in the military, and that was a very uh,
There's a
you
little bit of
know
a little bit of a softer landing than
well, a lot of a softer landing. They get pats on the back and promotions for some of the things that they experienced and the like. So it was a career benefit to them in a
Hmm.
lot of ways.
Hmm.
And they're around the camaraderie of other veterans who served that are, thankful for their service and their experience. Where the guys that came home and got out, the drafted guys and the like, um, they came home to a community. Some of them, their family members weren't going to give them a bunch of grief over it, but by and large, they decided that it was easier to not share those experiences and to bottle them up within themselves. I know I did that for 35 years, and it took a devastating toll on my private life. I've been divorced 3 times. Um, I've been in a couple of long-term relationships. It didn't hurt my professional life because I was a workaholic. I mean, that was my addiction, was work. And so the harder I worked and the busier I was, the less time I had to think.
Hmm.
And so I was a dedicated workaholic. I'm still pretty much a workaholic here. I take care of this place by myself. I am involved with these 3 organizations in town. We also do a jazz and blues festival at the end of October. So there's always a lot going on, and I'm busy all the time. Um, but I reflect more on the experience of Vietnam because of the veterans groups that I belong to and the things that I work with to help make veterans' lives better here.
Hmm.
And I have a lot of veteran friends. Most of everything I do is surrounding veterans. So um,
I'm
it's been a great healing experience to be here.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm curious, when you get the property ready and you launch the vocational school that you talked about, or it's not really a school. I guess it's a school, a vocational
Well,
experience.
yeah, it's a hands-on work experience thing.
So when you do that, uh, how will you ensure that long after your involvement with that effort is past, that the people going through that program understand the origins of it?
Well, that's a good question, because I don't have any control over what happens after I'm gone. Um, but I want to leave it in a charitable trust with a very defined process.
But I mean, will you install a plaque or some sort of
Oh yeah, yeah.
informational video that people, I mean, how will they know that this experience that they're getting is from a Vietnam veteran who founded it to honor other Vietnam veterans and soldiers killed in action?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of things I'm trying to build that will identify that. One is I've designed this little monument for this back side over here on the other side of the 33 palm. I'm going to carve a thing out of the side. There's a hillside there. I want to carve an arc out of that, build a lava stone wall. And this lava stone wall will have a pond at the top and a pond at the bottom. And it'll be solar powered where there'll be a pump during the daylight hours. It'll pump the water from the bottom to the top and flow back down to the bottom. And it will have 5 vines that go from the top down the face of the wall with 11 leaves on each vine. and that's for the 55 guys who died in the assault and the defense of Landing Zone Gold in the Battle of Suoi Tre. And hopefully, the other part is to leave a little brass chain with a name tag on each one of the 33 palms.
Yeah.
Uh, listing the name of each of the 33 who died that morning. I don't know if that'll live on past. And the other thing is it's always about finance and survivability economically. There's enough fruit crops on this property to generate, I don't know, maybe $30,000 a year in gross income, which can help maintain part of it. Um, it's always about money. That's the sad part about it. I'm going to have to find some kind of a group that wants to undertake this. If you just leave it without any kind of a plan, you never know how long it'll last. Uh, Property taxes, insurance, and all that stuff go on and on and on.
Yeah.
If this place takes a lot of maintenance, um, I probably burn up a couple $100 worth of gas every month just in my lawnmowers. Uh, and the lawnmowers are not cheap. They're $15,000-$20,000 each. Uh, so yeah, it's a large expense. I don't know how I'm going to manage to make this all happen. But I'm kind of the belief if you work hard at it enough and you believe in it and you're willing to put all your eggs in that basket, somehow it'll find a way. Um, and that's pretty much how I've lived my life. I've always had all my eggs in one basket. You're always afraid of dropping the basket. Uh, but yeah, it's one of those experiences in life where I just feel dedicated to honoring the guys that I knew that didn't come home,
Yeah.
and
Well,
bringing this wall here to Hilo is that, I don't know. It's kind of like looking at your mortgage and somebody that stamps it paid in full.
oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Debt repaid. Yeah. Well, Michael, I'm sorry that I can't have my camera on right now, but it eats up too much bandwidth for the signal that we have. So,
Yeah,
but I want to
thanks.
thank you. I want to thank you for just spending this time with me and also all the time that we spent talking before this interview. Um, I really appreciate your generosity of spirit, your willingness to talk about things that are difficult to talk about. But more than anything, I appreciate your drive to repay that debt. It's inspiring.
Well, I appreciate you understanding, and you know it's a journey. The journey doesn't end until you take your last breath. I will honor and remember those guys and the experience until I take that last breath. Um, it's kind of an overwhelming kind of thing to dwell on, and um, I just take each day as it comes and do what I can every day. And I just hope that memory lives on. That what we've done to honor those veterans, not just here but throughout the country, and what the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund has tried to do with touring this wall, which we are the lead off for the 29th season. Um,
Yes, you are.
that that more attention um, is paid to um, those veterans who served in Vietnam who had so little thanks. It's like the World War II generation have been dubbed the greatest generation. It would be nice if this nation would finally recognize that the Vietnam veterans were every bit equal to that. It was just a different time.
Yeah. Oh, I have an entire rant about that, but I won't go into that now.
Yeah, and it's like, no, this wasn't an issue to stop fascism from taking over the world, or Vietnam might have been a questionable adventure, just like Iraq is a questionable adventure. Um, but don't blame the warrior for what the politicians get us into. Um,
Well,
the
particularly when there's
people
a
who,
draft on.
yeah, and I don't think our society today, because you look at the population, how many people are there in our society today that have never known a draft? Um, the draft ended in what, 69 or something like that, went to a lottery, and then the draft was officially thrown out, I guess maybe in the early 70s. So for 53 years, anybody under 50, anybody under 60 years old doesn't know anything about the draft.
Right.
And to
Unless they
think
listen to
that,
episode 3 of this podcast.
yeah, and America really needs to have some kind of a national service program. Um, People have to know that they owe something to the nation, which has given them the opportunity to be anything that they choose to be. It's unique in the world that um, we are self-governing, or supposed to be self-governing, and we can take a long time to even talk about that. We the people, by the people, for the people.
Right.
Uh, it is something I believe that everybody owes something to the nation. It's like what John Kennedy said long ago. Don't ask what your country's going to do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I've lived that most of my life. I was in Korea when John Kennedy was killed. Uh, I thought we were going to war. I was actually a security guard guarding nuclear warheads for Honest John rockets. And that night that happened, it was nighttime in Korea. All of our rocket launchers from the 4th Missile Command came out to our storage area and actually mounted their nuclear warheads on those rockets. And, it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Um, we had no idea. And we've been living with that nuclear threat ever since. It would be nice. It's like John Lennon's tune, Imagine. It'd be nice if the world could live without war.